Hi, so I'm Serena. I'm the vicar of St Mary's Church in Banbury. Banbury is a market town in North Oxfordshire, which has an interesting history and demographic of people who live here. Although Oxfordshire is seen as being a wealthy place, Banbury has always struggled with pockets of poverty and deprivation. I came to be the incumbent of St Mary's because I was really drawn by the church community's strong sense of the breadth of inclusion. St Mary's is part of the Inclusive Church Network and the Heart Edge network of churches too. Being an inclusive church is not something that you do once and then it's done. It means always learning and listening to other people's experience and challenging ourselves as to whether we are still fulfilling our remit to be inclusive. This is something I personally feel passionate about. I feel a sense of calling towards. Throughout my life, I have witnessed and experienced exclusion, and so feel a desire to listen to the stories of those on the margins and how they can be included. When I was considering my calling to the priesthood, one thing that pushed me on was this desire to speak up for the marginalised. I believed if I wasn't part of the church, who was going to speak for those who have no voice and are dismissed for being different? I was brought up in a predominantly single parent family. I never knew my father, so I lived in a white household with my mum and elder sister, who was a different dad to me. However, my mother brought us up to see ourselves as sisters rather than half sisters. I think my mum recognised some of the problems I would face being a person of colour, so tried her hardest to shield me from that. This meant that I didn't really see myself as a person of colour growing up. It was only later in life that I came to understand the racism that had happened to me over the years. While at theological college, I reflected a lot about my life and realised that some actions and behaviours that I had encountered had happened due to the colour of my skin. I remember going on holiday to San Francisco and going into a cafe kind of bar type of place. A white friend and I went up to the person who was serving, the person you go to speak to seat you. And there were a couple of tables at the front of the cafe right next to the window. Yet the woman at the desk wasn't willing to sit us there, saying they were reserved. Yet while we were standing there, a white couple sat themselves down at the table and we'd been talking about, and she didn't do anything about it. She said that we could sit at the bar area at the back, which was hidden, if we wanted to. We said no and left. My friend dismissed the encounter as just the waitress being a bit rubbish. But later on, I realised that she didn't want us sat at the front of the cafe because of me. I think this realisation blew my mind a bit because I just hadn't recognised it happening before. Over the years, I've described myself as mixed race. However, this is a term I grew up with in a predominantly white environment that encompassed not only my home, but my school and where I lived. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was pregnant with her first child, and her partner is half Turkish. I said to her that her child would be mixed race, and she was so offended and upset by what I said. It was difficult for me to understand why she was so offended when it was a term I described myself as. Today, some people prefer to use the term shared heritage as a more inclusive description. So I would encourage you to think about the language that you use and what impact it could have. Some people of colour might say that I could pass for white, which means initial impressions of me by people who make assumptions about Black people might not always apply to me. I'm also aware that having grown up in a predominantly white household and community, I didn't initially notice the racism that I encountered, which meant that the undercurrent of that type of abuse didn't have so much of an impact on me and my sense of self. I can see the privilege that my lighter skin and protection from some ignorance affords me, which is why I use that to advocate for my darker skinned brothers and sisters. As someone of shared heritage, I have experienced both being an insider and an outsider. I think this perception has meant I have always felt drawn to speak up for those whose voice has been trampled on or taken away. It is one of the reasons I am an LGBTQIA+ chaplain, because I feel passionately about being an ally to that community and to speak up for them when so often their stories are diminished or ignored. Since the age of about 10, I thought that one day I would become a priest, but always believing it would happen when I was a lot older. For me, my faith really came alive while singing in church choirs. I had the great privilege of singing at a variety of cathedrals throughout the country over the years, and it's always been in those places that I feel closest to God. In my late teens, I went to Taizé for a week with my church, St. Luke's in Maidenhead. For those of you who've never been to Taizé, on your first day, you are basically given a job, and I was tasked with leading a little Bible study group. It was a great experience and made me think more about this niggling calling to the priesthood. After uni, I became cabin crew for British Airways and did a master's in building conservation while I was still working. I also volunteered on my days off at the Children Open Air Museum. I remember one day while I was at the museum, someone asked me what my dream job was. And after doing all that study and volunteering, I was left wondering, what is my dream job? One Easter, I was at church singing in the choir, and while the prayers were happening, I heard a voice behind me say, "I want you to be a priest." There was no one behind me in the choir stalls, and the voice didn't come from my head. I heard it in my ears. I decided not to tell anyone and think about it for a while. A couple of weeks later, I was in church again. This time I was helping as a server or an acolyte. And while I was tidying up in the vestry after the service, the voice came back and said, "You need to tell someone." I looked up and the associate priest, the Reverend Canon Terry Robinson, walked in. She looked at me and said, "Are you okay?" And I blurted out, "I think God wants me to be a priest," and then proceeded to burst into tears. 3 years later, I was at theological college after having spent a year on an internship programme in Stepney, East London. After theological college, I spent my 3 years of curacy at St. Luke's in Reading. I had a great training incumbent who supported me a great deal during that time. However, I did struggle a little bit because, as far as I was concerned, I didn't look like a priest. Most of the priests I had seen throughout my life had been white men, so it took me some time of reflection to think I could do this. One day during my curacy, at the end of a service where I had preached, a Black woman and her granddaughter came up to me at the end and she said to the child, "See, you can do it too." It made me realise how important it was to be seen and to do what God has called me to do. Over the last couple of years at St Mary's, we've been working on expanding our church choir. And I've been incredibly blessed with some secondary school children coming to sing in the choir. One of them is a young person who is of shared heritage, and I remember thinking, she looks like me. After her second service with us, she asked if we could have a chat and said how great it was to see a priest that looked like her. We talked about some of the challenges faced by being shared heritage, but also the blessings. It was good to be an example to this young person that being a leader of shared heritage was possible. God has called me, the whole person that I am, to be a priest, to minister to the people, to preach the gospel, and to speak out against injustice. Today, I still have moments of self-doubt, and I'm aware I put a lot of pressure on myself to do my work well because I fear the consequences of things going wrong. I think that looking different from the average priest makes me feel that if I make a mistake, others will feel justified in their assumption that if I don't look like a priest, I shouldn't be one. Whenever I do a funeral visit, I still have in the back of my mind that the family might not want me to take their family member's funeral, either because I'm a woman or because of the colour of my skin. However, I think attitudes are changing and people are more accepting of people's differences, and that priests do and should represent the breadth of God's people. So I would encourage you to think about your calling. God has called you, the whole person that you are, to minister to the people. What gifts has God bestowed on you to help you share the good news of the gospel? What stories can you share that will encourage people to become disciples of Christ?